send out your questions through the chat box. And I also would like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Rowan Palmer.
Thanks very much, Sophie. I hope everyone can hear me okay, but please let me know. If not, I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second. You should be able to see my blue slide.
Yes,
If not,
perfectly.
please say something, but otherwise, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Sophie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us, depending on where you are. My name is Rowan Palmer, and I work in the Resources and Markets branch of the UN Environment Program. I'm based in Geneva, and I lead our team that's working on sustainable infrastructure investments in the context of the broader green economy transition. So as Sophie mentioned, I'm going to give you an overview today of our work on sustainable infrastructure. This work is not specifically focused on procurement and sustainable public procurement, but it's very relevant. So I'm going to start with just a very broad overview of the infrastructure work, but then at the end of my presentation, I'll get into some of the implications for sustainable procurement issues. Excuse me. So getting started, really the entry point for us on this infrastructure work is the SDGs, because infrastructure influences all of the SDGs. This graphic shows the results of some UNOPS work that analyzed the influence of infrastructure on each of the SDGs, and it shows that infrastructure is linked to 92% of the 169 SDG targets across all 17 of the SDGs. And so the most obvious, the most obvious connection is for socioeconomic SDGs, because we need infrastructure to deliver things like clean water and energy and education and all these kind of things. But from our perspective at UNEP, it's also important because of the potential negative impacts that infrastructure development can have on the environment and the environmental SDGs. So for example, the World Bank estimates that infrastructure assets account for 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement won't be possible unless we transition to more low carbon and resilient infrastructure. And then all types of infrastructure have direct and indirect impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, and then other goals related to sustainable consumption and production, sustainable cities and communities, decent work and economic growth won't be possible if the infrastructure that supports them isn't sustainable and resilient. So if infrastructure investment continues to go into unsustainable, non-resilient infrastructure, then we're not going to be able to achieve the SDGs. And so the question is, how do we try and ensure that we have the infrastructure required to provide all of the services we need without impacting the environment so negatively? And so this centrality and importance of infrastructure for the SDGs was recognized by the UN member states. In the UN Environment Assembly in 2019, they passed a resolution on sustainable infrastructure that calls on member states to develop and strengthen national and regional systems level strategic approaches to infrastructure planning. It calls on UNEP to support member states to develop sustainable infrastructure as a means of implementing the SDGs. And then specifically, it called on us to collect and share best practice and share this information with member states. And so our work then at UNEP over the last 2.5 years has really been based around fulfilling this mandate that we received from this resolution. And our our work to implement it began with a scoping of the available guidance and the discourse on sustainable infrastructure. And we identified three main gaps where we thought we could add some value. The first is that in the past, traditionally, there's been um, a rather narrow conception of sustainability when it comes to infrastructure, because there's been a huge focus on the climate aspects of it, which is of course important, but some of the other things like biodiversity and nature or social inclusiveness have been left out of the discourse a bit compared to climate. The second gap is that when it comes to infrastructure, sustainability is usually addressed at the project level. So often relying on safeguards connected to financing, really taking a sort of a do no harm approach. And this is, this project focus is natural and important because projects ultimately are the unit of infrastructure development, but it raises the third gap we identified, which is only looking at sustainability at the project level misses opportunities to incorporate sustainability in a more systemic way during the upstream phases of the life cycle. So here we're talking about strategic planning at the national or regional level, or at the urban level in the case of big cities, and project prioritization and preparation. Basically, all these things that happen before you start working specifically on a project. And so this is important because these upstream interventions can have benefits that then cascade downstream and make it easier to address project level sustainability. So based on this analysis, we decide that we should focus our efforts on addressing these gaps. And so we convened a working group of experts from our Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership. And this Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership is a network of organizations. Some of the main ones you can see here on the slide. But basically, it's an informal network of partners that are working together on three shared objectives. The first is to raise awareness about the importance of sustainable infrastructure for the 2030 agenda. The second is to develop streamlined normative and technical guidance for scaling up sustainable infrastructure. And then the third is to provide technical assistance and capacity building to developing countries to apply the tools and resources that are available. And so working with partners from this network, we started working on developing a international good practice guidance principles for sustainable infrastructure. And these are 10 principles that are designed to help policymakers take needs-based, systems-level, integrated approaches to planning and delivering sustainable infrastructure. They apply to the whole infrastructure lifecycle from the, as we call them, the upstream phases, so the strategic planning through to project prioritization, design, construction, operations, all the way to decommissioning. But there is a strong focus on the enabling policy environment and the planning phases that occur upstream of any single project. And so I'm going to go through the 10 principles one by one, but before I do that, I'd just like to take a step back and talk about a couple of the definitions and concepts that we use when talking about sustainable infrastructure, because I think they're important to understanding these core ideas of the principles. So the first is just that when talking about infrastructure, I'm not talking about any particular sectors. Really, we're talking about infrastructure in all sectors. So we have the traditional infrastructure sectors like energy, transport, and water, but also covering other sectors like housing, food systems, telecommunications, health systems, things like that. The second thing is, and a very important thing, is that our discussion of infrastructure systems includes both built or gray infrastructure in all of these sectors, but also natural or green infrastructure. And here I'm talking about nature, about landscapes and ecosystems that provide many of the same services as built infrastructure and should be accounted for in infrastructure planning. And then also we have hybrid infrastructure that combines these elements of the green and the gray. In the picture here, you have an example probably everyone is familiar with. A green wall or green wall roofs are also quite common, but there's lots more examples of this type of hybrid infrastructure. And then when I'm talking about sustainable infrastructure, using this definition that was adapted from one developed by the Inter-American Development Bank, and yeah, it states that infrastructure systems are those that are planned, designed, constructed, operated, and decommissioned in a manner to ensure economic and financial, social, environmental, and institutional sustainability over the entire life cycle. So it's a pretty straightforward definition, but there's two things to point out about it. The first is that sustainable infrastructure is not any specific type of infrastructure or a particular sector of infrastructure. It's really referring to the outcomes of infrastructure development. And just because an infrastructure project might be in a sustainable sector like renewable energy, it doesn't mean it's necessarily sustainable in a holistic sense. Perhaps it might be low carbon. If you think of say a wind turbine, it could be it's a low carbon energy solution, but there may be negative impacts to biodiversity or social impacts to local communities depending on where it's placed. So really we need to think about sort of all of the outcomes of infrastructure development to determine how sustainable it really is. And then the second thing to point out is just that when I'm talking about the infrastructure life cycle, I'm not just talking about the project cycle, but this is part of it. But as you can see here, and as I've alluded to already, the full life cycle also includes these phases that occur upstream of the project, and those are those are really important for what we're talking about. So with those underlying concepts in mind, I'll now go into the 10 principles, which you can see here. I'll just go through one by one. So the first is strategic planning. So this principle is really about infrastructure development decisions being based on long-term strategic planning that is aligned with global sustainable development agendas. So the SDGs and the Paris Agreement are the two key ones right now, but also aligned with any other kind of international commitments that countries have made. And this type of long-term strategic planning needs to be supported by an enabling environment that facilitates the right kind of institutional coordination. So, cross-sectoral discussions that are happening as part of infrastructure planning. The second principle is about responsive, resilient, and flexible service provision. So the first part of this is about really understanding what the service needs are, and then deciding how to what service needs are and how they might change in the future, and then seeing how different infrastructure solutions can be deployed to best meet those service needs. And it's about doing integrated planning so that projects can have can take advantage of possible synergies and maximize connectivity, and building in flexibility and resilience. So flexibility in terms of service provision that can change according to changing demand, and then resilience to shocks, both in terms of, physical resilience, like, for example, being like climate resilience is what everybody thinks about, but also, in what I would call, I guess, institutional resilience, or I guess that's part of the flexibility part, that, infrastructure could withstand, rapid or unexpected declines in demand, such as we've seen during the pandemic, for example. The third principle is about comprehensive life cycle assessment of sustainability. So the comprehensive part means not just thinking about financial or economic risks, but including environmental and social risks to the project and impacts as well. And then these these risks and impacts should be assessed for each stage of the infrastructure life cycle, across the whole life cycle, and also considering the cumulative impacts of multiple projects. So thinking beyond the boundary of a single project, and taking into account cumulative impacts, and impacts from projects beyond their site, and this can include transnational impacts as well. The fourth principle is avoiding environmental impacts and investing in nature. So choosing development sites such that the impacts on biodiversity from the infrastructure development and from the operation of that infrastructure are minimized. It also includes thinking about nature-based solutions. So thinking how investments in nature, and either protecting or restoring natural ecosystems, can either replace built infrastructure options, or be used in place of built options, or complement the built infrastructure options. And an example of this would be, a common one is protecting wetlands or mangrove habitat, for example, that can serve as flood protection for built infrastructure that's located in coastal areas, versus building a seawall or some kind of engineered solution. The fifth principle is resource efficiency and circularity. So infrastructure construction uses a massive amount of natural resources to build it. It uses a huge amount of concrete, which takes up a huge amount of finite sand resources in the world. It also uses a lot of water. So this principle is really about decoupling infrastructure development from resource use, pollution, and waste. And to do this, principles of circularity should be designed into infrastructure from the beginning. And this is something that links to public procurement processes, and why it's really important to incorporate sustainability criteria into those processes early. The sixth principle is about equity, inclusiveness, and empowerment. So this is about making sure that infrastructure investment is balanced between social and economic priorities. Right now, there's an imbalance where the majority of infrastructure investment goes into what could be considered economic infrastructure, and not as much into social infrastructure. And the lines between those categories can often be blurry. But basically, this principle is about taking the social considerations and social inclusiveness into account, and making sure that infrastructure is providing services that are accessible and affordable to the people who need them, taking into account the different needs of different groups in society. So incorporating gender considerations, for example, into infrastructure design and operations. and then also making sure that infrastructure development avoids harm to communities, to users, and is safe and protects human rights as well. The seventh principle is about enhancing economic benefits. So infrastructure development should seek to create economic benefits as well as environmental and social co-benefits, and really to make the most out of it, to try and optimize the employment impacts in design and procurement strategies and processes for infrastructure, involving local businesses and local labor as much as you can to help create higher multiplier effects for the economic benefits. And this is, of course, really relevant in the context of COVID recovery spending, where infrastructure investments are being targeted as a way to stimulate the economy and create jobs. And so it's really important to make sure that some of those the enabling policies are in place around those things to to maximize the potential there of these investments. Principle 8 is about fiscal sustainability and innovative financing. So basically, when countries are deciding how to pay for and finance infrastructure investments, debt sustainability should be something that's taken into account. Here, sort of this integrated systems level planning and thinking about this during the upstream phases of project development is important for understanding the fiscal sustainability across the whole lifespan of the infrastructure. And then fiscal and financial transparency are an important part of this. And then just considering all of the different options available, whether infrastructure is to be publicly financed or privately financed, or a mix of both. The available options need to be considered in the context of what the services are that are being provided, and some infrastructure may lend itself more to private financing than others. So it's important to consider many factors when deciding how to finance infrastructure. The principle 9 is transparent, inclusive, and participatory decision making. And so this one is really about stakeholder consultation, public participation, and making sure that processes to include this are integrated really throughout the infrastructure lifecycle, beginning early on at the strategic planning phases, when different options really truly are on the table, and not sort of presenting projects to stakeholders as a fait accompli. And then this also includes mechanisms that should be in place to respond to stakeholders' grievances related to various aspects of the infrastructure development. And then finally, the final principle is on evidence-based decision making. And so this is really about using data to make decisions about infrastructure planning, allocating enough resources to data collection and data sharing, and then also to collecting the right kind of data. For example, disaggregating social data by different groups who are affected differently by infrastructure development, and one of the big ones here is collecting gender disaggregated data, for example, find out how infrastructure is going to impact men and women differently, and also taking into account the ways that they use infrastructure differently and use the services differently. So those are the 10 principles, and in a nutshell, the way we describe these is this basically outlines what we call a needs-based, systems-level, integrated approaches to infrastructure planning. And so by needs-based, we really mean, planning that uses data to understand the need for services and then considers how to meet those needs most effectively and sustainably using all the available options. And so very importantly, these could include alternatives to building new gray infrastructure. Things like managing demand for certain services, rehabilitating or upgrading existing infrastructure, or investing in natural infrastructure. The second part of it, this idea of systems level interventions, this is really just as opposed to project level interventions. So this is the emphasis on incorporating sustainability into the enabling environment and into those upstream strategic planning phases of the life cycle. And the idea is that by considering sustainability as early as possible, you have more options on the table that are still going to be politically, economically, or technically feasible before you've gone too far down one path that then eliminates other options. Once you're looking at a specific project, you've already lost opportunities to do things a different way. And then finally, the integrated aspect is really about thinking beyond the project. So thinking of infrastructure as one big system of interconnected systems. So considering the environmental, social, and economic aspects of sustainability and how they relate to each other, where the synergies and trade-offs might be. It's about considering the interlinkages between different infrastructure systems and different sectors across the life cycle, considering nature as infrastructure, as I mentioned, and then understanding the negative and positive impacts of infrastructure development at the cumulative level. So not thinking about single projects in isolation of others. And so these types of approaches we think can have a lot of advantages in terms of sustainable development outcomes. They can help result in infrastructure that's better aligned to users' needs, can help optimize the synergies and balance the trade-offs between the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. By considering nature as infrastructure, these types of integrated approaches can help lead to infrastructure development that can strengthen nature's ability to provide services. And this has many co-benefits for biodiversity, for the climate, for human health and well-being. Can result in longer lasting infrastructure that's flexible in its delivery of services and is more resilient to various risks, including climate risk. And then also by identifying and mitigating potential risks, and especially environmental and social risks earlier in the planning process, can help reduce the likelihood of conflict or opposition to projects. So really it's about getting better results for the money that's invested in infrastructure development. And we know this is a major part of public budgets that are already under a lot of pressure anyway. So it's especially in the context of the fallout of the COVID pandemic, it's important that this money is invested effectively. So that's basically it for these 10 principles. These are complemented by a couple of things. The first is a set of case studies that illustrates the implementation of various aspects of the principles. There's one case study corresponding to each principle, and this was published in February at the same time as the principles, but we're also developing an ongoing and growing database of case studies. So this is an ongoing effort to develop those as resources. Just to give a quick example, one of the case studies for Principle 5 on resource efficiency and circularity, the case is about Singapore and its green building initiatives. And so by 2030, Singapore aims to green 80% of their buildings. And they've put a number of policies in place to help this, to try and incentivize the incorporation of resource efficiency and circularity into the building planning and design. So using sustainable designs and green technologies, and there's a lot of sort of policy interventions that have been designed to support this, using various incentives to try and incentivize developers to meet these. Um, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, but I would suggest maybe to
Yeah, sorry, I
disable
think I
your
muted myself.
camera.
Um, okay.
Thank you.
So in addition to the case studies, the principles are also complemented by an online resource called the Sustainable Infrastructure Tool Navigator that we've developed in partnership with GIZ. This is an online database of tools that can be used for integrating sustainability throughout the infrastructure lifecycle. And so the types of tools include, guidelines or rating schemes and standards, as well as more technical things, modeling tools, valuation tools, things like this. But the database is designed so that users can navigate the various tools by different parameters. You can navigate by type of tool. You can navigate by sector, by life cycle phase, by type of stakeholder. So really, it's designed to help match users with the types of tools that they need. And also we're linking this to the case study database by trying to develop case studies on the use of all the tools in the database. So this is the introduction to the broad work on sustainable infrastructure. Based on this work we've been doing, we've also then gone and developed some guidance and policy briefs on specific aspects of this, digging a little deeper into various aspects. And one of those areas is on sustainable public procurement. And so obviously this is the procurement of infrastructure, and that sort of phase of the life cycle is a really critical point, and in many ways where the some of the interventions that have taken place in the enabling environment and during those upstream planning phases really get translated down into the project level. And so it's really critical that those aspects are well embedded into the procurement processes to make sure that they end up getting translated well further downstream. And just the scale of infrastructure investment that we are expecting, points to how important this is. I mean, there's various estimates out there, but one of them is that $94 trillion will need to be invested in infrastructure by 2040 to meet growing demand for various services around the world. And a major share of this, we know, will be paid by governments, who are the primary planners and financiers of infrastructure projects. Another stat that sort of puts the scale in perspective is that about 75% of the infrastructure that will be required in developing countries 10 years from now is yet to be built. So there's a huge amount of infrastructure development that we're expecting. This presents a significant opportunity to try and make sure that infrastructure is much more sustainable than the infrastructure we've built so far. And since public procurement makes up such a significant portion of public budgets and is ultimately going to be procuring a high amount of infrastructure, this is really an opportunity to influence change at a really big scale. And so we've worked with a few partners, some of our colleagues working on Sustainable Public Procurement to put together this policy brief on sustainable public procurement and infrastructure. And I'll just outline a few key messages here. I should say that the brief is about to be published, so it's I don't have a link I can share at the moment, but I can share it in the next few days when we have it available with the organizers, and I think they could make it available to everybody. So some of the key messages from the policy brief is that there tends to be currently a lack of sustainability criteria in procurement procedures, and also a lack of objective methods to assess these criteria. So this is the case for environmental sustainability, but also particularly a problem when it comes to social sustainability. So rather than being based on solid sustainability criteria, the lowest price is often the main criterion used in public procurement. And so this needs to change, and other criteria should be accounted for as well. There's also still in many countries just a lack of awareness and lack of information about the use of different sustainable procurement tools. So it just means that some of these available solutions are just not being considered by procurers. So there's a need to really just simply raise awareness and get information out about these tools. Some effective tools include various types of sustainability certifications and rating schemes for infrastructure projects. These can be a good way for procurers to embed sustainability criteria into infrastructure contracts. So for example, making it a contractual obligation to obtain a certain certification. Probably most people are familiar with some of the green building certifications out there. The LEED is a very common one, but there's dozens and dozens of certifications. Some of them are sector specific, some of them are more general, but these can be useful tools for sustainable procurement. Another tool which is particularly relevant for sort of large scale infrastructure contracts is the use of performance-based criteria and performance-based approaches. So specifying expected sustainability targets that need to be met, but not specifying how they should be reached. And so this is a way to tap into some of the innovation and new thinking of especially private sector companies who may be bidding on contracts, and especially in the case of large infrastructure projects where the service provision is specified, but there may be a lot of leeway to how the different bidders are going to propose to meet the requirements. Another key point is that in addition to governments, the multilateral development banks and private investors also play an important role in financing infrastructure and can help to encourage sustainable infrastructure solutions. So engaging with these other types of actors, for example, via PPPs, public-private partnerships, can help to promote the integration of sustainability criteria, and in general, more coordination between different types of stakeholders will help to mainstream sustainability into infrastructure procurement. And then finally, I guess coming back to the principles a bit, sustainable public procurement needs to be based on strategic, integrated planning processes that consider all available options for meeting service needs, and then align infrastructure investments with national and global sustainable development targets and objectives. That's where I'm going to leave it. I'm talking for a long time, so I hope everyone is still with me. But I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rowan, for this insightful presentation. Sustainable infrastructure is a vast topic, and thanks for narrowing it down to public procurement. And I think you have shared, well, very useful tools such as the guiding principles and this set of 10 case studies, and also the sustainable infrastructure navigation tool. And while we wait for questions to come in, I think you highlighted some very important key success factors. Please add a few if I'm missing some of them. You have outlined how strategic planning is important and considering sustainability at a very early stage, as early as possible, and also considering the full life cycle and lifespan of infrastructure. And a third one also being the use of certification and green building rating systems. I think the policy brief mentions that some countries have developed their own national rating systems, such as India and China. And the use of performance-based specifications is also very important, specifying not only what you want to procure, but the objective of what is procured, and wording it in a way that sustainability is included. Would you like to add maybe some important factors?
Sorry, just looking for my unmute. I mean, I think you covered all the main ones there.
And I have also another question is, are there international green building rating systems that are internationally recognized, or is the trend mostly to develop national rating systems?
I should, before I answer, preface it by saying I'm not an expert at all on green buildings, so I can't really speak to the trend. Definitely there are international green buildings ratings for sure, but I don't know if the trend is going more towards national ones or not. I mean, I think, um, yeah, I think it makes sense, to take advantage of what's out there, and to the extent that they're applicable in whatever the national context is,
Mm-hmm.
use the available international standards, or at least use them as a starting point. But yeah.
And I would also encourage core members to share their experience through the chat box if they have any to share. We have received one question from Ms. Rowena Candice Ruiz from the Philippines, from the Government Procurement Board. Thanks, Rowan. I very much appreciate your learning session. I want to get your thoughts if you're just beginning to embed SPP tools in the procurement framework. Where would you start? Would you also consider thresholds and start with smaller projects? And would there be tools best fitted for smaller projects as compared to large multi-year projects? So how to start?
Thanks. That's a really good question, and really the key question. And I mean, I have to say again that I'm not an expert specifically on procurement, and I'm not a procurement professional. But I think definitely it depends on. I think there's different tools available for different size projects and different applications. And I think, the choice of, if the question of where to start comes down to using a particular tool or an approach, um, I think seeing what's been successful in other countries, or just even in another, depending what level you're working at, but what maybe another city has used, basically seeing what's been done successfully and what's had good results, for um, projects of a similar size, or you know similar projects, is a helpful way to start. Um, I imagine, I mean, obviously, applying these things to the big, multi-year, high value projects are going to have bigger impact. But I think, probably piloting things on a smaller scale makes sense. But I don't think there's any threshold in terms of where it's worth applying them or not. I think it depends on the tool that's being used, and picking something that makes the most sense, and trying to take advantage of the experience that other people have already had in using them, and learning from what's been done.
Thank you, Rowan. I think that indeed our members can learn from the case studies that you published. And I would like to add that as a general rule in sustainable public procurement implementation, it is usually better to start small, indeed, so as to start with a pilot project, for example, and then extend it to more significant projects. And we also have another question from Mr. or Ms. Sena Beiris. Are there any rating systems available for natural infrastructures and hybrid infrastructures?
So that's a really good question. I think, I mean, the one thing that jumps to mind, I'm not sure if it would quite qualify as a rating system necessarily, but I think something, the most relevant thing would be, um, the IUCN. I think it came out last year or maybe earlier this year, but the IUCN has put out a global standard for nature-based solutions. And so I would say that is the starting point in terms of standards for natural infrastructure or hybrid infrastructure. Nature-based solutions is quite a broad term, so it applies to more than I think just infrastructure development in the sense we're thinking about it. But that would be the starting place I would point to, is the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. That said, I think other rating systems, for infrastructure projects, do account for natural infrastructure, or hybrid infrastructure and nature-based solutions, in that they're not specifically for rating those types of things, but the use of nature-based solutions, or natural infrastructure as part of a project development would be, would be counted by the score. It would affect your score in some way, I assume positively, but yeah, it would sort of, yeah, account for those types of things. But in terms of something specific for NBS and natural infrastructure, the IUCN Global Standard would be the place to start.
Thank you.
And
We also
I'll put a link in the chat to it
okay.
here.
We also have another question. Can you please share your experience or views under the topic in relation to developing country application? I think you mentioned, Rowan, that 75% of infrastructure is yet to be built by the year 2030. So, of course, it is a great opportunity to include sustainability as early as possible in those new projects. And are there any, do you have anything specific to add in terms of views related to infrastructure in developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, so as part of the development of the 10 principles, as part of that process, we had sort of an international expert group that was drafting them. But as part of the process, we did extensive consultations with member states, and so with people working in government, in ministries of environment, but also in other parts of government responsible for more directly for infrastructure development. And so I think we consulted, I think it was something like, I think it was more than 80 different countries participated. And so we heard, um, yeah, we heard a lot about people's experiences in developing countries um, trying to do sustainable infrastructure. And I mean, a couple of the main takeaways were that in many cases, it's even where people may want to want to improve the sustainability of their infrastructure planning and investments, it's really hard to know. I mean, kind of like the question we had earlier, just where to start. Especially, there's so many resources out there. There's so many tools. It's really hard to know. You hear about different things being applied in different countries. You have funding coming from different donors and different sources who all have different ways of doing things. So I think one of the biggest challenges is just kind of navigating, what's out there and where do you start. And this is kind of the thinking behind why we have this tool navigator site, but also really the case studies, because a lot of questions that I think people, that we keep getting over and over again is people want to know what other countries have done, especially other countries in the region. Well, what have they done? What's been successful? So this is why I think something simple like a case study, which might not be the sexiest or most exciting thing, I think is really a valuable tool, because it helps people to understand well, what somebody else did. Why did they decide to use that tool or take that approach? And it just helps give the entry points. And then after that, I think a big challenge in a lot of countries is then just having uh, the sort of the technical and institutional capacity to apply some of the tools and approaches. So especially when it comes to strategic planning, uh, you need to have the planning process set up in a way that has this cross-sectoral kind of interministerial collaboration, and it's not always easy to establish those kind of processes. Um, and then having the sort of more technical capacity, I guess, to use some of the more technical tools, modeling tools or things like this, isn't always there. So then it's a case of trying to and this is a big part of what our work and our partners' work is doing, is trying to provide that support to countries who are looking to implement those things. And then I guess a third thing that is definitely not this is not specific to developing countries at all, but is pretty much universal, and is a major challenge, is just the fact that when we talk about sustainable infrastructure planning, we need to be thinking long term, because number one, the infrastructure we build lasts for decades and decades. So the lifespan is huge. The impacts of a good choice versus a bad choice are then locked in for decades. And in the case of more sustainable solutions, it may be that, it requires, that the upfront costs might be a little more, but in the long run, when you account for the long-term costs and also some of the environmental and social externalities, the uh, the uh, the sustainable infrastructure solutions make much more sense. So it really requires long-term thinking. But when these decisions are being made, they're political decisions, and political cycles are usually quite short. in many countries, you sort of have like, 4 or 5 year political cycles. And so it's really, this is the universal challenge, is trying to separate infrastructure planning uh, from these more short-term political cycles. And that there's a few countries that have established kind of somewhat independent infrastructure planning bodies that are to different degrees, but somewhat politically independent. And this is a really important part of it as well.
Thank you, Rowan. You have outlined how it is important to understand indeed where to start and how to actually implement sustainable infrastructure. I think your team is doing a great job, and we will share, of course, with the network in the future any publications or useful resources that would be beneficial to our members. We also we received a question from Dr. Keo Van Troon in Cambodia. However, as his question is more focused on legislation, I think that we can discuss this maybe in another webinar. He was mentioning that today Cambodia has public procurement. Do we need to develop a new legislation related to SPP or GPP? Of course, modifying the legislation and embedding SPP or GPP into the national legal framework is a very important step to allow SPP or GPP to really develop and be implemented properly in the country. And we also have received another question, and this will be the last question that we will take. For public procurement, is there a successful case study of a government that was able to incorporate life cycle assessment for their cost consideration? So, well, Rowan has already shared the set of case studies, and also, of course, well, our team, the Sustainable Public Procurement team at UNEP, will soon publish the global review of SPP, which will include some specific case studies. And
I was just, Sophie, sorry, that was one thing I was going to mention at the end as well, is this case study database is an ongoing effort. So we're always happy to hear about new cases. So if anybody, yeah, if any of the participants have examples they think would make good cases, please feel free to get in touch and let us know, because we're always looking for more of them.
Thank you. And then besides any information that the network can share, where would they find relevant information about sustainable infrastructure? I think you shared the Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership website.
Yes, that's one place, and I mean that's more focused on the activities of our partnership, but there, people can find links to various resources. And I'm just looking, here we go. I'll put in the chat the link to the Tool Navigator website as well, because I think, yeah, that's a good resource for people to use.
Thank you very much. So before we close the webinar, I also think it is important to mention that the COVID situation has significantly impacted the infrastructure sector. And as infrastructure investment plays a major role in recovery plans, we cannot outline enough how important it is to consider the sustainable procurement of infrastructure. Now we will close this webinar, and I will give the floor to our colleague from KT, Ms. Yumi Chung. Ms. Yumi, if you can please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you.
I'm sorry for the late because of the security issue. I couldn't really log in.
This is fine, thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for organizing this wonderful Thursday webinar. And thank you for Mr. Robin Palmer as well for your wonderful presentation. And of course, last but not least, for the 20 network members who are participating in listening and questioning of what you heard and discussed during this webinar as well. But as I listened the presentation of Mr. Palmer, I was quite surprised that the overall like good practice guidelines that you mentioned, like 10 different guidelines, are very much linked with the Sustainable Development Goals that generally discussed in different issues. For example, like comprehensive life cycle approaches and resource efficiency, circularity, and as well as inclusiveness is all very highlighted in different aspects. For example, like sustainable consumption and production, as well as like the infrastructure and sustainable development in general. So I think this is very relevant to discuss in this forum as well in this webinar, but as well as very much linked to the general like policy guidelines to different very different aspects of our daily lives and the policy forum. So thank you for the general like policy issues, but at the same time very specific issues linked to the GPP for this webinar. That was very comprehensive to understand from top to very down. And adding up to this, I think that policy is not for one size fits all approach that you can you cannot solve everything in one approach. So that's why we are here having different series of webinars discussing different best practices and lesson learned because we don't know the exact answer for everything. So in this sense, I thank you for Sophie and Mr. Palmer again, and I hope to see you all for our next webinar to our network members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yumi. And we will now close this webinar. We thank all attendees and our main speaker, Rowan, for a great webinar session. Thank you and have a pleasant rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.